We're now on video 5 of Liturgy and Sacraments for the Catholic Distance University. And we're going to talk in this video about liturgy and tradition. The concept of tradition, it's very important to get it right. There was a schism that took place when Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre ordained bishops without the approval of the successor of Peter. That is specifically a schismatic act when you do that. So it set up a very difficult situation for Pope John Paul II. And John Paul II actually made a pronouncement about that. He wrote a letter about that, which is in your bibliography. But one of the things that the Pope pointed out in response to this was that the folks who did this, his group of people who love the liturgy of the Old Missal, of 1962 Missal, sometimes called the traditional Latin Mass or called the Tridentine liturgy. Those who love that liturgy need to be given the opportunity to express themselves in that liturgy and to experience that liturgy. But the problem is that those who deny the validity of the changes that took place and who are very negative about the liturgical reform of the Council, that oftentimes their real problem is they don't understand tradition. This is John Paul II's analysis of the situation. And I would say it's very, very important here to recall tradition with a capital T and tradition with a small t. That distinction was made by the theologian Yves Congar, who had a very important role in the Council. As a peritus, he was made a cardinal by John Paul II because he made such a great contribution to the life of the Church. The Catechism actually uses his distinction in paragraph 83. So tradition with a capital T is that which cannot change because it comes from Christ and the apostles. Traditions with small t are things that arise over the centuries, and they oftentimes convey and express that tradition with a large T, but they are not absolutely indispensable, instituted by Christ. They may be useful in a particular time. Later, they may prove to be inadequate or just not necessary expressions of tradition with a capital T. All right. So it's important to get clear. There are some things that change over time and some things that can't. Now, this has to do with development of doctrine. This also has to do with liturgy. It's the same problem. You have to understand tradition right. You also have to understand that it's the magisterium's role to have the last say, the final say, as to what is truly scriptural and what is truly traditional with a capital T. And so it's the magisterium has a responsibility to make the final determination that something is changeable, that it's tradition with a small t, or it's non-changeable tradition with a capital T. Now we're going to come back to this time and time again. This is basically flowing from what we studied in fundamental theology class and the teaching there on scripture, tradition, magisterium, okay? But I just want you to recall the great canon or rule of St. Vincent of Lerins. It's called the Vincentian Canon. It helps us identify what is truly tradition with a capital T. Vincent says it's what is found semper, ab omnibus, and ubique. Semper, ubique, et ab omnibus, which means always. When we find something always, when we find it ubique, everywhere, where we find it of all, ab omnibus, okay? So always, everywhere, by everyone, that's tradition with a capital T, all right? So, for example, the Eucharist and the teaching that the Eucharist is truly the body and blood of Christ, that is found everywhere. And the descent that began on that one really was in the 16th century. So going back to all the ancient churches, you find it everywhere, and all the fathers of the church. Okay, so that's an example. Now there are other things, like the rosary is not tradition with a capital T. We didn't have the rosary in the form we have it in now until the 16th century. And it's a Western devotion, not an Eastern devotion. Okay, so this is a very, very important canon, and it's a yardstick. So I'm going to encourage you to memorize this, and you're responsible to know it, but apply it. Apply it as you think through various controversies in the church and various issues having to do with liturgy. Okay, now the reality that is conveyed by the sacraments, that's signified by the sacraments, that cannot change. The essence of the sacraments, bread and wine in the Eucharist, water and baptism, this cannot change. But the way in which the sacraments are celebrated in a church's liturgy, that does change over time. It has changed. It will continue to change. It varies from time to time. It also varies from place to place. Now, from place to place, we've always had multiple rites in the church, at least since the 4th century, 5th century. We've had the rites or traditions that we're going to talk about in a minute. And before we talk about the different rites in the Catholic Church, we just need to make a few distinctions. Number one, there's a liturgical family. So there's a family of that really shares a common cultural heritage. And it's a cultural heritage of people, of particular saints. It's a cultural heritage of a language many times. It's a cultural heritage of a way of expression, of a way of praying, a way of celebrating liturgy. Okay, so it's a whole, and it covers usually a big geographical area. All right, so there's liturgical families. Then there's rites. Within those families, there are specific rites. So there's a specific integrated way of celebrating all the liturgical ceremonies, liturgy of the hours, sacramentals, the year, the Mass, sacraments, everything. So it's an integrated way, and it's distinctive, and it's expressed and codified in authorized liturgical books, authorized by the pastors of specific churches. Okay? So in other words, to be a liturgy, you've got to be official, but everything, it's really important to understand that the centralization in Rome didn't really begin a whole lot until pretty late in our history. And that goes for liturgy as well as for a lot of other things, certain government stuff. You know, we didn't have a big Roman Curia back in the 5th, 6th, 7th century, not even in the 8th or 9th century. We started to see more of that happening in the 11th, and especially after the Council of Trent, we see a growth of centralization in the way the church is governed in the West. But even then, there were Eastern churches that it didn't apply to. Okay, so what I'm trying to make clear here is that there were groups of bishops or patriarchs who codified different liturgical books over the history of the church that differed from one to another, even within the same geographical region, as we're going to see in a minute. So a rite is a specific authorized group of liturgical ceremonies and books, okay? And it comes from a family that has a whole spirituality and heritage in back of it. Churches are different from rites. There are actually several different churches that use the same rite. For example, the Byzantine rite. There's a lot of churches, and by church we mean a self-governing group of particular churches or dioceses. They're presided over either by a patriarch or a major archbishop. Okay, they have they have a liturgic. They're coming from a family, and they have a specific rite. So they have their own specific heritage, but they're organized as a specific church. So you may know or may not know, there are 22 Catholic churches. The Western Church, the patriarch of that church is the Pope. And the Pope has a role as supreme teacher and touchstone and court of appeal for all the other 21 Catholic churches. But the Pope doesn't govern really the day-to-day naming of bishops and affairs of the 21 Eastern Catholic churches. They are autonomous in the sense of day-to-day, but they're in full communion with the See of Peter. Okay, so it's important, don't confuse, as many do, rites with churches, because many different churches have used the same rite, the Byzantine rite, for example. And there's not one Eastern rite, so don't talk about the Eastern rite of the Catholic Church. You can talk about Eastern rites, or it's better to talk about the Eastern churches. If you're speaking of people, talk about the Eastern churches within the Catholic Communion. If you're talking about different liturgies, then you talk about the Eastern rites. Okay, so let's look at the major liturgical families in the Catholic world. First of all, we'll start with, most of us are Western Catholics. So or Western Christians. If we're Protestant Anglican, we're part of the Western liturgical family, or Latin liturgical family, because that's our heritage. Okay, so the Roman Rite is one rite that became predominant in the West. It's the Roman Missal, which means the Missal used by the Pope, the Bishop of Rome. Okay, now it's important to know that really it was only after the Council of Trent that the other Western missals became pretty much not used. Now, there are still Western missals that are not Roman that can be used. One is the Ambrosian Rite from Milan. Another one is the Mozarabic Rite, which the center of that is Toledo, Spain. And it's not used much, but it's the ancient liturgical heritage really before the Muslim conquest, in the time of the fathers of the church, and the rulers of Spain at that time were Arians, Visigoths. But anyway, that's where the Mozarabic Rite comes from, very ancient Spanish liturgical rite. And keep in mind, in the early church, there wasn't liturgical centralization. So there was a Gallican Rite in France. There was also, religious orders had their own rites, and they can celebrate those rites from time to time, like the Cistercians and the Dominicans. So anyway, the point I'm making here is there was liturgical diversity even in the West, and the Council of Trent did not want to wipe out that diversity, but it just kind of happened after the Council of Trent that more and more the Roman Missal became universally used in the West. Okay, but this is the Latin liturgical family with a number of different rites. If you want, you can look for Ambrosian chant, which is the earliest chant of the church, still preserved in Milan and used in the Ambrosian Rite. It sounds a bit like Gregorian, but it's more ancient. It's a bit different, and many times the way it's performed, you'll notice that it sounds more Eastern in a certain way than what we know as Gregorian. Anyway, let's look at the Eastern liturgical family. So you got the Western ones. The Eastern ones, they are still very much alive, even though they're much smaller in number than Western Christians, just in terms of numbers. Whether they're Orthodox or Catholic, the Eastern churches are smaller in numbers, okay? So we'll look at, number one, the Alexandrian liturgical family. Alexandria was really, there were three great cities of the Roman Empire. Three great Christian centers, because there were three great metropolises that in the Roman world. One was Antioch, another besides Rome was Alexandria. Those three cities were the greatest cities in the ancient Roman world. And so the bishops of those two cities, other than Rome, they had a great impact on the life of people all around them, and not only the teaching of the people around them, but also the liturgical life of the people around them in the geographic area where they were. So Alexandria, there's a whole Alexandrian liturgical family. It's expressed in two different rites: the Coptic Rite of Egypt and the Ethiopian Rite of Ethiopia. And the Coptic and Ethiopian are both from this Alexandrian family. And they both, by the way, are celebrated by Catholic churches and by Orthodox churches. So there's a Coptic Orthodox church that celebrates the Coptic Rite, and that's the larger one. And there's a very small Catholic Coptic church that celebrates the same rite, but is in full communion with the Pope. Same thing in Ethiopia. Okay, the larger family is the Antiochene liturgical family, and under the Antiochian liturgical family, you have a lot of wonderful communities. One that I know the best, you have the Western Syrian family. So there's subfamilies. All right, the Western Syrian family includes the Maronites from Lebanon and from Syria. I was a member of a Maronite parish for a long time. So was my family. And by the way, that's okay, that's legit. I still was a subject in canon law of the Roman bishop, because I grew up Latin Rite. But I was able, by his permission, to receive, my kids received confirmation. Some were baptized in that church, in the Maronite church. So Western Syrian Maronite is one. Another is the Syrian Rite, and that's mostly used by Orthodox churches. And then there's the Malankar Rite, which is India. India was missionized out of Antioch, so it has an Antiochian rite to it. All right. Then you have the Eastern Syriac family. And there you have the Chaldean Rite from Iraq, and then the Malabar Rite of India. And then finally, you have the Cappadocian family. Cappadocia is what's now eastern Turkey. And you had great fathers of the church come out of there. Basil the Great, if you remember. Gregory of Nazianzus. Gregory of Nyssa. Those are the three great Cappadocian fathers. And that's a great stronghold of early Christianity in the patristic age. So out of that area comes the Byzantine Rite and the Armenian Rite. The Byzantine Rite picked up a lot of the courtly ceremonial of Constantinople and of the emperor. So it's a very lavish rite, and you know, so it's quite different from Armenian, but they come from the same background. Armenian was much humbler, stayed in the east, far away from the center of the empire, much more Middle Eastern in its feel. But anyway, these are the rites of the church, okay? And the beautiful thing about this is liturgy bears tradition, but at the same time, it incarnates it, it enculturates it in a myriad of different ways. So what's really wonderful is when you experience, for example, a Byzantine Eucharist, a Maronite Eucharist, a Roman Latin Eucharist, you can really see tradition with a capital T. You can see what is distinctive to all these rites that you don't find in the others, but you find out what is common. And both are magnificent. And what is common in the tradition is expressed in different ways, and different things are highlighted by these different rites. One of the things just to keep in mind is that liturgy is the primary vehicle of the ordinary magisterium of the church. That's Pius XI. It's a primary place where tradition is conveyed. You're bathed in the tradition of the church when you enter into the liturgy.
دمني شمية ورا رب الشيوخة غيرنا شاقع إلا قديش قديشات